Russia did not need to fire a missile at America to change the balance of fear. It only needed to prove that one missile could work. That is the part many people still do not understand. In geopolitics, the most dangerous weapons are often never used. Their first purpose is psychological. A launch test becomes a signal. A deployment announcement becomes a warning louder than any speech. And sometimes, one weapon quietly forces every capital in the world to rethink what power really means. The missile is called Sarmat. NATO calls it Satan II. But the name is not the real story. The real story is the message behind it. Moscow is telling Washington something simple. Sanctions may hurt Russia. NATO may pressure Russia. Ukraine may drain Russian resources. But America still cannot remove Russia from the final level of power. That level is nuclear deterrence. And at that level, one successful missile matters more than entire fleets of tanks or aircraft. For years, many Western analysts believed Russia's strategic weapons program was mostly theater. They saw delays, failed tests, sanctions, and the economic pressure created by the Ukraine war. From those facts, they reached a comfortable conclusion. Russia was threatening more than it could deliver. But geopolitics punishes comfort. A delayed weapon is not a dead weapon. A failed launch is not a failed program. And a country under pressure can still build something powerful enough to frighten stronger rivals. That is the paradox of Russia today. It may struggle in conventional war, but strategic war follows different rules. Moscow cannot match Washington dollar for dollar, alliance for alliance, or technology for technology. But nuclear deterrence was never about matching every tool. It was always about preserving one unbearable consequence. Sarmat exists to remind the world that consequence still exists. Professor Jiang would put it this way: when a great power unveils a weapon it may never intend to use, the first purpose is not destruction. The first purpose is restraint. Russia wants America to hesitate. It wants NATO to think twice before escalation. It wants Europe to understand that every step in Ukraine now carries a larger shadow. But here is the danger. A weapon designed to prevent war can also increase the risk of miscalculation. Once fear enters policy, caution starts looking like weakness. Every signal becomes a test. So the real question is not simply whether Sarmat can strike America. The real question is why Russia wants the world thinking about that possibility right now. And in geopolitics, timing is never accidental. Putin did not choose this moment by accident. A nuclear announcement is never only about the weapon. It is about the calendar, the battlefield, the audience, and the fear it creates in the enemy's mind. Russia is still fighting in Ukraine. Europe is tired. America is divided. NATO is stronger on paper, but more nervous in practice. So Moscow is sending a message at the exact moment when every side is already calculating risk. The message is not simply, Russia has a new missile. The message is, do not believe Ukraine is the only battlefield. That is the deeper signal. Washington may see Ukraine as a controlled proxy war, a place where Russia can be weakened without direct American combat. But Moscow wants Washington to remember that Russia still has escalation tools outside Ukraine. Sarmat is one of those tools. It moves the conversation from trenches and drones to cities, silos, and survival. This is why timing matters. If Russia announced Sarmat from a position of complete confidence, the message would be strength. But if Russia announces it while bleeding in Ukraine, the message becomes more complicated. It may be strength, but it may also be pressure. It may be confidence, but it may also be a warning from a state that wants the West to stop before Russia is pushed too far. Professor Jiang would say the most dangerous country is not always the strongest country. Sometimes it is the country that feels cornered, but still possesses weapons of civilization-ending power. That is the Russia problem. Its conventional army can be slowed, its economy can be sanctioned, its alliances can be pressured, but its nuclear arsenal cannot be ignored. And when Moscow feels that conventional pressure is rising, it naturally reaches for the one arena where it still demands equality with Washington. So Putin's message is aimed at several audiences at once. To America, he says, missile defense will not give you freedom to escalate forever. To Europe, he says, your security depends on decisions made in Washington, but the consequences will fall on your continent first. To Ukraine, he says, Your battlefield victories will not erase Russia's strategic depth. And to the Russian public, he says, even under sanctions and war, Russia remains a great power. That is why this announcement matters. It is not just about hardware. It is about political psychology. Moscow wants fear to return to Western decision-making. It wants hesitation inside NATO meetings. It wants American planners to ask one extra question before each escalation. And in geopolitics, that one extra question can change the entire war. The mistake many people make is thinking Sarmat is dangerous simply because it is large. That is not the real issue. Size matters, but design matters more. Sarmat is not only a bigger missile, it is a missile built to attack the assumptions behind American defense planning. That is why it creates fear beyond its physical power. It is not just a weapon of destruction, it is a weapon of penetration. Older nuclear logic was easier to understand. A missile leaves the ground, crosses the polar route, enters space, then descends toward its target. American radar and interceptor systems were built around that kind of expectation. They were designed to watch certain directions, calculate certain trajectories, and respond within a narrow window of time. Sarmat challenges that logic. It tells Washington that the old map may no longer be enough. The first danger is range. A weapon with extreme reach does not only threaten distance, it threatens predictability. If a missile can be launched from deep inside Russian territory and still reach almost any target, then geography loses part of its protective value. Oceans no longer comfort, borders no longer separate. The battlefield becomes planetary. That is the psychological power of an intercontinental weapon. The second danger is payload. Sarmat is designed to carry multiple warheads, not just one. This is the part ordinary people rarely understand. One missile does not always mean one target. With independently targetable re-entry vehicles, a single missile can separate into several nuclear threats, each moving toward a different objective. One warhead may aim at a military base, another may aim at a command center, another may aim at a city. The missile becomes a swarm. And this is where missile defense becomes much harder. Intercepting one incoming object is already difficult. Intercepting several warheads, decoys, and unpredictable trajectories at extreme speed is a different problem entirely. The defender must detect, classify, prioritize, and respond in minutes. If it guesses wrong, the consequence is not a lost battle. The consequence is national catastrophe. Professor Jiang would say, Sarmat is not designed to win a nuclear war. No rational state truly wins such a war. It is designed to make the opponent believe that defense will fail before war begins. That belief is the weapon's deeper function. If America thinks it cannot stop enough warheads, then America must hesitate earlier. And hesitation, in strategic politics, is power. This is why Sarmat is different. It attacks confidence. It attacks the belief that technology can make nuclear escalation manageable. It attacks the idea that missile defense allows one side to pressure the other without paying the ultimate risk. The missile is not only aimed at cities, it is aimed at certainty. And once certainty disappears, every decision becomes heavier. America's missile defense problem is not that it has no shield. The problem is that the shield was never designed to make America completely safe from a full Russian strategic strike. This is the uncomfortable truth. Missile defense can reduce certain threats. It can complicate an enemy's planning. It can protect against limited attacks. But against a large nuclear power with advanced delivery systems, the shield becomes less like a wall and more like a signal of hope. Washington rarely says this clearly to the public. The public hears words like interceptor, radar, early warning, and defense architecture, then assumes there is a system strong enough to stop the nightmare. But nuclear strategy does not work that way. A missile defense system must be nearly perfect under the worst conditions. The attacker only needs a few warheads to get through. That imbalance is terrifying. Sarmat was built to exploit exactly this problem. It does not need to defeat America in a conventional sense. It only needs to make American leaders doubt the shield. If one missile can carry multiple warheads, decoys, and possible unpredictable paths, then every defensive calculation becomes unstable. Which object is real? Which target matters most? How much time is left? These questions may have to be answered in minutes, not hours. This is why the psychological effect is so powerful. Missile defense creates confidence. Sarmat attacks that confidence. It tells Washington that billions of dollars, advanced radars and interceptors may still not guarantee protection. And once protection is uncertain, escalation becomes more dangerous. Leaders who once believed they could pressure Russia safely must now ask whether any crisis could move faster than their ability to control it. Professor Jiang would say this is the weakness inside technological power. America often believes every strategic problem can be solved by better systems, better sensors, better software, and better weapons. But nuclear deterrence is not a normal engineering problem. It is a political problem wrapped inside physics. If the enemy can still impose unacceptable damage, then the shield does not erase fear. It only changes the way fear is managed. That does not mean America is helpless. It means America must be honest. A missile shield can support deterrence, but it cannot replace deterrence. It can reduce risk, but it cannot abolish risk. And if political leaders pretend otherwise, they may create the most dangerous illusion of all: the belief that nuclear escalation can be controlled like a conventional military operation. This is the real danger of Sarmat. It does not have to destroy the shield physically. It only has to destroy faith in the shield politically. And once that faith weakens, every NATO decision, every Ukraine escalation, every Russian warning, and every American response becomes heavier. The missile is not only flying toward targets, it is flying toward assumptions. The most dangerous mistake in intelligence is not missing a failure. It is misunderstanding what that failure means. In 2024, when Russia's Sarmat program reportedly suffered a serious test failure, many in the West saw what they wanted to see. They saw a crater. They saw embarrassment. They saw proof that Moscow's doomsday missile was more propaganda than power. And for a moment, that interpretation felt comforting. But comfort is not strategy. A failed test does not always mean a failed weapon. In advanced military programs, failure can be part of development. Engineers learn where the system breaks. Commanders learn what must be corrected. Political leaders learn how much time they still need. The question is not whether Russia failed once. The question is whether that failure stopped the program. And now the answer appears clear. It did not. This is where Western analysis often becomes too emotional. After Russia's early failures in Ukraine, many observers began to treat every Russian weakness as proof of permanent decline. Poor logistics became total incompetence. Battlefield losses became strategic collapse. Missile delays became technological impossibility. But great powers do not disappear because they stumble. They adapt, repair, conceal, and return. Professor Jiang would say the West confused humiliation with incapacity. Humiliation can damage prestige, but incapacity means the machine can no longer function. Russia was humiliated many times in this war, but its strategic weapons industry did not stop working. Sanctions slowed it. War strained it. Test failures exposed it. Yet none of those pressures destroyed the deeper priority: preserving nuclear credibility. That is why the Sarmat failure mattered less than the Western reaction to it. Moscow learned technical lessons. Washington learned the wrong psychological lesson. It began to believe that Russian threats were becoming hollow. And that belief is dangerous, because once an enemy is dismissed too easily, every future warning sounds weaker than it should. Now the narrative has reversed. The weapon that was mocked is being treated seriously again. The program that was delayed is no longer dead. The same analysts who once pointed to failure must now explain why failure did not prevent deployment. This does not mean every Russian claim should be trusted. Moscow exaggerates. Moscow performs. Moscow uses fear as policy. But dismissing everything as theater is not wisdom. It is another form of blindness. The lesson is simple. Never build policy on the enemy's worst day. A serious state must judge an adversary by what it can recover from, not only by what it suffers. Russia failed, but it recovered. Russia delayed, but it continued. And now Sarmat returns not only as a weapon, but as a warning against Western overconfidence. To understand why Sarmat worries American planners, you must understand three words: MERV, FOBs, and direction. These are not technical details for engineers only. They are the heart of the fear. Nuclear danger is not just about how powerful a warhead is. It is about how many are coming, where they are coming from, and how little time the defender has to decide. MERV means multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. In simple language, one missile can carry several warheads, and those warheads can separate toward different targets. That changes everything. America is not facing one object in the sky. It may be facing a cluster of real warheads, possible decoys, and fast-moving signatures that must be judged almost instantly. In nuclear defense, confusion is not a small problem. Confusion is part of the attack. Then comes FOBs, the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. The concept is old, but the danger remains modern. Instead of following the expected route over the northern polar region, a missile with this kind of capability may use a partial orbital path and approach from a less expected direction. For decades, American warning systems were shaped by geography. They watched the direction planners believed Russian missiles would most likely come from. Sarmat threatens that assumption. If a weapon can approach from the south, then the map changes. The shield may still exist, but the geometry becomes less comfortable. Radars, interceptors, command systems, and decision chains are all built around time and direction. Change the direction, and you change the time. Change the time, and you change the political pressure inside the decision room. Professor Jiang would say this is why Sarmat is more than a missile. It is an attack on prediction. Great powers survive by predicting danger early enough to respond. But what happens when the enemy builds a weapon designed to make prediction harder? What happens when one missile carries many threats, and those threats may arrive from where the shield is least prepared to look? This is not about panic. It is about the loss of certainty. America may still have classified capabilities. It may still have powerful defenses. But Sarmat forces Washington to ask a colder question. Can any defense system guarantee protection against a complex nuclear strike from a peer power? If the answer is no, then deterrence returns to its oldest form, not safety, but mutual fear. And that is the real meaning of MERV and FOBs. They do not only increase destructive power, they reduce confidence, they compress time, they multiply targets, they make leaders hesitate before escalation. In nuclear politics, hesitation is not weakness. Sometimes hesitation is the last barrier between crisis and catastrophe. Sarmat is frightening because it attacks from above. But Russia's deeper message is that fear should not come from one direction only. That is why Poseidon and Burevestnik matter. They create a second layer of uncertainty. One weapon moves through the ocean, another may move through the air. Together, they tell Washington that the nuclear problem is no longer only about missiles rising from silos and crossing the polar sky. Poseidon is the underwater nightmare. It is described as a nuclear-powered unmanned vehicle moving through the sea rather than the atmosphere. The strategic meaning is simple. America has spent generations watching the sky, building radar, interceptors, satellites, and warning systems for missiles. But Poseidon asks a different question. What happens when the threat does not fall from above, but travels silently beneath the ocean? Even if some claims about Poseidon are exaggerated, the concept alone is powerful. It creates fear along coastlines. It forces planners to think about ports, naval bases, undersea detection, and the vulnerability of cities facing the Pacific and Atlantic. A weapon does not need to be perfectly understood to be strategically useful. Sometimes uncertainty itself becomes part of deterrence. Then comes Burevestnik, the nuclear-powered cruise missile. Its promise is different. Not speed alone, but endurance. A conventional missile has fuel limits. A nuclear-powered missile suggests a weapon that can travel for very long distances, approach from strange angles, and complicate detection. Whether every Russian claim is true is not the point. The point is that Moscow is building systems designed to make American defense think in every direction at once. Professor Jiang would say Russia is not only modernizing weapons, it is modernizing fear. Sarmat threatens the sky. Poseidon threatens the sea. Burevestnik threatens the airspace between expectation and surprise. This is a three-dimensional warning. It tells America that no single shield, no single radar line, and no single defensive theory can cover every possible path. This does not mean Russia is invincible. These programs are expensive, complex, and politically dramatic. Some may face failures. Some claims may be inflated. But in nuclear strategy, perception matters. If Washington must spend more time asking what is real, what is exaggerated, and what may appear in a crisis, then Moscow has already achieved part of its purpose. The second layer of fear is not about one perfect weapon. It is about forcing the enemy to defend against many imperfect possibilities. That is how pressure works at the strategic level. You do not only threaten destruction, you multiply uncertainty until every decision becomes slower, heavier, and more dangerous. The Sarmat story cannot be separated from Ukraine. That is the mistake many observers make. They treat the missile as a separate military update while the war continues somewhere else. But in Moscow's mind, these two things are connected. Ukraine is the battlefield where Russia is being drained. Sarmat is the signal that Russia still controls a higher level of escalation. This is the logic of nuclear signaling. When a country struggles in conventional war, it may remind the world of its strategic weapons. Not because it wants to use them tomorrow, but because it wants every enemy decision to carry fear. Moscow wants Washington to ask one question before each new weapons package, each intelligence upgrade, each deeper step into the war. What if Russia answers somewhere outside Ukraine? That is why nuclear signaling is powerful. It expands the battlefield without moving the front line. The fighting may be in eastern Ukraine, but the psychological pressure reaches Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington. Russia is saying, you may arm Kyiv, you may sanction Moscow, you may weaken our economy, but do not forget that escalation has levels you cannot fully control. Professor Jiang would say Ukraine has become more than a war over territory. It has become a test of limits. The West is testing how much pressure Russia can absorb. Russia is testing how much fear the West can tolerate. Each side believes it is acting carefully. Each side believes it understands the red lines. But history is full of wars where red lines were only clear after they were crossed. This is why Sarmat appears at such a dangerous moment. Russia needs to show that it is not merely surviving the war. It needs to show that it remains a strategic superpower. The missile becomes a symbol for domestic audiences and a warning for foreign enemies. It tells Russians that their country is still feared. It tells NATO that Russia is still dangerous beyond the trenches. But the danger is that signaling can be misunderstood. Washington may see it as intimidation. Moscow may see Western support for Ukraine as slow-motion escalation. Europe may see hesitation as weakness. Ukraine may see caution as abandonment. In that confusion, every side can believe it is being rational while moving closer to a larger crisis. The Ukraine war is not just consuming weapons. It is consuming trust, patience, and restraint. Sarmat enters this war not as a battlefield tool, but as a shadow above the battlefield. And shadows matter. They change how leaders speak, how generals plan, and how far alliances are willing to go. The world is already inside a new arms race, but most leaders refuse to call it that. They use softer language, modernization, deterrence, strategic stability, defense readiness. But behind those words, the reality is clear. Russia is building weapons to penetrate American defenses. America is studying how to preserve its shield and its second strike power. China is expanding its nuclear forces. Europe is waking up to a threat it thought belonged to the last century. This is not the Cold War repeating itself exactly. It is more unstable. The old Cold War had two main nuclear centers. Today, the system has more players, more technologies, more regional wars, more cyber risks, and less trust. Arms control agreements are weaker. Communication channels are thinner. Political leaders face domestic pressure to look strong. In that environment, every new weapon becomes not only a defense tool, but also a political statement. Sarmat is part of this larger race. It tells America that missile defense cannot create strategic immunity. It tells China that Russia is still a central nuclear power. It tells Europe that the continent remains trapped between geography and escalation. And it tells smaller states one frightening lesson. In a dangerous world, nuclear weapons still command attention in a way ordinary armies do not. Professor Jiang would say this is the tragedy of modern security. Every great power claims it is only reacting. Russia says it is reacting to NATO expansion and American missile defense. America says it is reacting to Russian aggression and Chinese growth. China says it is reacting to American containment. Each side calls its own buildup defensive, while seeing the enemy's buildup as offensive. That is how arms races become self-feeding machines. The danger is not only that more weapons are built. The danger is that leaders begin to trust weapons more than diplomacy. When treaties weaken, missiles become the language. When communication fails, military exercises become messages. When trust disappears, every test launch becomes a warning. And once nations speak mainly through weapons, misunderstanding becomes easier than peace. No government wants to admit this openly, because the word arms race sounds like failure. It suggests that decades of strategic management are breaking down. But refusing to name the race does not stop it. It only makes the public less prepared for what is happening. The Sarmat announcement is not the beginning of the race. It is the moment when the race becomes harder to deny. And this is the part that should worry everyone. A world with stronger weapons but weaker rules is not more secure. It is more nervous, more reactive, more vulnerable to mistakes. The new arms race is not coming. It is already here. Professor Jiang's final warning is simple. Do not confuse silence with safety. Nuclear danger does not disappear just because missiles are not flying. Sometimes the greatest danger grows quietly. One test launch, one deployment announcement, one military signal can suddenly remind the world that history never really ended. It only became quieter. Sarmat matters because it changes behavior before war begins. It makes generals cautious. It makes diplomats nervous. It makes presidents pause before escalation. That is the true power of strategic weapons. Their greatest effect is not destruction. Their greatest effect is hesitation. But hesitation cuts both ways. Too little caution can lead to escalation. Too much fear can lead to surrender. If Washington ignores Moscow completely, risk grows. If Washington fears Moscow too much, pressure becomes effective. If Europe panics, unity weakens. And if Russia mistakes caution for weakness, it may push further. This is how dangerous misunderstandings begin. That is why this story is bigger than Russia and America. China is watching. Iran is watching. North Korea is watching. Every government is learning the same lesson. How does the world respond when nuclear pressure returns to global politics? Professor Jiang would say leaders must avoid two mistakes. The first is arrogance, believing technology and military power can erase nuclear danger. The second is panic, believing one missile changes everything. Both mistakes are dangerous. Arrogance encourages escalation. Panic encourages blackmail. Real strategy lives between them. The world does not need blind confidence. The world does not need fear. It needs discipline. America still has strength. Russia still has limits. Europe still has choices. But choices become harder when fear returns to strategy. So the real lesson of Sarmat is not that war is inevitable. The real lesson is that peace is becoming harder to protect. Old assumptions are fading. Old rules are weakening. And when fear returns to great power politics, every decision becomes heavier. The final question is not whether Sarmat can reach America. The real question is whether leaders still have the wisdom to stop before weapons like this become more than warnings. Because history shows something uncomfortable. Technology grows faster than human judgment. And human judgment is often the weakest defense of all.